What would you do if you woke up from surgery and discovered your own child had emptied your bank account? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I checked the numbers twice. When I opened my eyes, the hospital ceiling looked like every other hospital ceiling I'd ever seen, plain, beige, slightly cracked near the vent. The kind of ceiling you stare at when you're waiting for anesthesia to pull you under. Only this time I was coming back. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Mrs. Whitmore? Margaret? Can you hear me? I could. Barely. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 78 years old. A retired high school principal. A widow of 13 years. And up until that morning, I believed I understood the difference between raising a child and trusting one. The surgery had been scheduled for weeks. A routine abdominal procedure, they said. Manageable risk. At my age, everything carries manageable risk. My son Daniel insisted on driving me to the hospital. He kissed my forehead before they wheeled me back. Don't worry, Mom. I've got everything covered. Everything. Those words echoed differently later. In recovery, once the fog of anesthesia lifted enough for my hands to function, I reached for my purse. It wasn't there. A nurse explained Daniel had taken my belongings for safekeeping. That didn't bother me. He was my only child. 45. Successful. Married. Responsible. At least, that's what I thought. When they finally brought my phone, I did what I've done every morning for the past 20 years. I checked my bank account. Not because I'm paranoid. Because I'm disciplined. When you grow up watching your parents survive the recession of the 70s, discipline becomes muscle memory. The screen loaded slowly over hospital Wi-Fi. Available balance, 0.00. I blinked. Refreshed. Closed the app. Opened it again. 3 outgoing wire transfers. 2 hours after my surgery began. Total, $142,000. Destination, International Holding Account. Barcelona. Daniel Whitmore listed as authorized initiator. Have you ever felt your stomach drop while lying completely still? That's what it felt like. Not panic. Not yet. Just gravity shifting under reality. The strange thing? I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. 2 months earlier, Daniel had asked about being added to my account. Just in case, he'd said. Emergencies. If something happens. Claire, his wife, had nodded enthusiastically. It's just practical, Margaret. Simplifying things. And her mother, Helena Strauss, had laughed softly over dinner. At our age, transitions are smart planning. At our age. I remember smiling politely. I remember thinking how interesting it was that my finances seemed to concern everyone except me. Here's what they didn't know. I had added Daniel, but not the way he thought. Limited authorization. No control over my retirement accounts. No access to my trust. Just liquid checking funds. Enough to tempt someone careless. Not enough to destroy me. Because years ago, during my tenure as principal, I handled a case involving a parent who siphoned PDA funds. I learned something then: trust should be emotional. Money should be structured. Still, structure doesn't soften betrayal. I called the bank from my hospital bed. A calm man named Martin Hale from compliance answered after being transferred twice. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently, we were expecting your call. Excuse me? Those words cut sharper than the numbers on my screen. Why would you expect my call? I asked. There was a pause. Because international transfers of that size, initiated during the account holder's scheduled surgery, trigger internal review flags. Scheduled surgery. They knew. The bank knew I was under anesthesia when the transfers happened. Which meant Daniel either didn't think about timing, or didn't care. Did you authorize these transfers while under medical sedation? Martin asked carefully. No, I replied. And then I said something that surprised even me. Don't reverse them yet. Silence. Ma'am? Let them go through review. Why would I say that? Why wouldn't I demand immediate reversal? Because instinct told me something bigger was moving. And if I yanked the thread too quickly, I'd never see the full design. 3 days passed. I remained in the hospital. Recovery steady. Vitals stable. Finances under quiet review. Daniel never visited. Not once. On the third evening, my phone rang. International number. He was crying before I even spoke. Mom, why are they asking questions? What did you do? Not what happened. Not are you okay? What did you do? Behind his panic, I heard something else. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Daniel, I said calmly, sitting upright in my hospital bed. Stay exactly where you are. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. And in that moment, I realized something devastating. My son hadn't just emptied my account. He had stepped into something he didn't understand. But what he didn't know was that neither had I. My son didn't steal from me in one night. It started 6 months earlier. If you think betrayal begins with a bank transfer, you're wrong. It begins with conversations. 6 months before my surgery, Sunday dinners at my house started feeling strategic. Daniel and Claire came every week. Claire would bring wine. Helena would sometimes join, always with a dessert that looked expensive and tasted forgettable. We'd sit at the same oak table Daniel grew up eating homework night spaghetti at. Only now the tone had shifted. Mom, Daniel said one evening, carving roast chicken like he owned the place, have you thought about streamlining your accounts? Streamlining. Such a clean word. Claire leaned forward. It's just about making things easier. You shouldn't be managing everything alone at your age. At your age. Funny how that phrase sneaks into conversations when money is involved. I smiled. I've managed my finances for 50 years. I think I'm still capable. Helena laughed lightly. Of course you are. But transitions are smart planning. Daniel shouldn't have to untangle things later. Later. The implication hovered over the table like steam from the gravy. Now let me ask you something. When someone starts planning your later while you're still very much here, what does that tell you? I didn't confront them. I observed. Because here's the contradiction no one talks about. The more people push to simplify your life, the more complicated their intentions usually are. 2 weeks after that dinner, Daniel called me. Mom, what if there was an emergency? What if you were unconscious? I'd be locked out. There it was. The seed. I agreed to add him, but under limited authorization. That means he could move funds within a capped structure, but he had no access to my retirement accounts, my trust, or my property holdings. Those were managed separately through an independent fiduciary I'd worked with for years. Daniel didn't ask about the details. He just seemed relieved. That should have been my first warning. Because when someone is satisfied without understanding the structure, they're not thinking long-term. They're thinking immediate access. 3 months later, I noticed small things. Claire mentioning rising costs. Helena talking about international investment opportunities. Daniel casually asking, how liquid are your assets? Liquid. Another clean word. One Sunday, Helena said something that stuck with me. You know, Margaret, Europe has wonderful residency programs if you invest wisely. Invest wisely. Daniel laughed it off at the time. We're not moving to Europe. But Claire didn't laugh. She looked thoughtful. Let's pause there. Because hindsight is cruelly precise. When my surgery date was confirmed, Daniel insisted on handling logistics. He knew exactly when I'd be under anesthesia. Exactly how long the procedure would take. And here's the detail that still chills me. The transfers happened 2 hours after surgery began. Not the next day. Not randomly. Precisely during the window when I couldn't answer my phone. Now ask yourself this. Is that desperation? Or calculation? Back in the present, as I lay in my hospital bed, Martin Hale from the bank called again. Mrs. Whitmore, there's something you should know. The receiving account in Barcelona had triggered automatic anti-money laundering review. Why? Because Helena Strauss had previously dissolved a consulting company under irregular financial circumstances. Nothing criminal, officially. But enough to flag scrutiny. So when $142,000 arrived from a U.S. account during the account holder's medical incapacitation? It lit up like fireworks. Daniel didn't know that. Claire didn't know that. Helena might have. I felt something then I didn't expect. Not triumph. Not revenge. Relief. Because suddenly, I wasn't the helpless elderly woman whose son emptied her savings. I was the documented victim of suspicious financial activity. There's a difference. But here's the part that complicates everything. When Detective Rowan Pierce called the next morning, his tone wasn't accusatory. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, we're reviewing potential elder exploitation. That word hit differently. Exploitation. It reframes the story, doesn't it? It means manipulation. Influence. Pressure. It means maybe Daniel wasn't the mastermind. Maybe he was the instrument. I closed my eyes and pictured him at 10 years old, saving coins in a blue ceramic jar labeled college. At 22, calling me breathless about his first job offer. At 35, promising he'd always take care of me. So what happened? How does a boy who once returned a lost wallet intact become a man who wires 6 figures during his mother's surgery? Was it greed? Was it fear? Or was it someone whispering in his ear that this was normal, justified, necessary? Then Detective Pierce said something that made my pulse slow to a dangerous calm. Mrs. Whitmore, your son isn't currently being questioned about theft. I swallowed. Then what? Potential participation in an international fraud conspiracy. Fraud conspiracy. That's not a misunderstanding. That's federal. Suddenly, this wasn't about my account anymore. It was about where that money was supposed to go next. And who Helena Strauss had promised it to. I realized then something unsettling. Daniel may have believed he was securing a future. But he might have stepped into a structure already under investigation. And if that was true, my son didn't just empty my account. He walked into a trap that wasn't meant for me. The crying wasn't about guilt. It was about fear. When Daniel called me from Barcelona, his voice didn't sound ashamed. It sounded hunted. Mom, they froze the account. Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. They froze the account. Behind him I could hear muffled voices. Echoes. Hard floors. Maybe a government office. Maybe an airport security room. Panic has a sound, and I heard it leaking through the phone. Who is they, Daniel? I asked calmly. The bank. Some financial authority. I don't even know. They're asking about Helena's old company. They think we're laundering money. We. Interesting word. Are you laundering money? I asked. No. Of course not. Then a pause. But Helena said it was just transferring capital ahead of an investment window. There it was. The investment. The European residency programs. The opportunity. The liquid assets conversation. Every breadcrumb leading to this moment. Daniel, I said carefully, did you take my money because you believed it would grow? Silence. Then a whisper. Claire said you'd understand. Claire. I could almost picture her, composed, persuasive, always framing selfishness as strategy. Here's the contradiction that hurts the most: Daniel didn't think he was stealing. He thought he was accelerating. Accelerating their future. At my expense. Let me ask you something. How easy is it to convince someone they're not doing something wrong, if you wrap it in the word family? I shifted slightly in my hospital bed, ignoring the dull ache in my abdomen. Daniel, I said, when did you book the flight? Another pause. The week before your surgery. There it was. Premeditation doesn't always wear a villain's cape. Sometimes it wears airline confirmation emails. You timed it, I said quietly. No, he snapped defensively. It just made sense. You were going to be recovering. You wouldn't need the funds immediately. Immediately. As if my life savings were grocery money. Then he said something that changed the temperature of the conversation. Mom. Helena said the account needed to show independent source movement to clear a previous audit. My heart slowed. Audit. Previous audit of what? Her consulting company. Something about dissolved tax filings. She said it was just paperwork. That this was temporary. Temporary. So my $142,000 wasn't just an investment. It was a bridge. A buffer. A demonstration of liquidity to satisfy scrutiny. In other words, my money wasn't growing. It was covering. Daniel, I said, did you transfer funds from anywhere else? And that's when his breathing changed. He wasn't crying anymore. He was calculating. Yes. Short answer. Heavy consequence. How much? It wasn't just your account. My grip tightened around the hospital phone. Explain. Claire had small business credit lines. Helena had residual accounts tied to the dissolved company. They structured staggered deposits under reporting thresholds. If you don't know what that means, here's the simple version: they tried to make large movements look small. Layered structuring. That's not ignorance. That's instruction. Who told you how to do that? I asked. Helena said it was normal in Europe. Of course she did. Daniel's voice cracked again. They're separating us for questioning. They're asking about intent. They're asking if we coordinated. Coordinated. Do you hear how quickly language shifts from family planning to legal terminology? 3 days earlier, he thought he was securing a better future. Now he was being asked about conspiracy. And here's the part no one expected. I wasn't shocked. 2 weeks before my surgery, I had called Martin Hale privately. Not to accuse anyone, but to request that any unusual international transfer during my hospitalization trigger enhanced review. Why? Because Claire had been pushing too hard. Too urgently. Because Helena's stories felt polished. Because instincts at 78 are sharper than people think. Mom, Daniel whispered, did you do this? I chose my words carefully. I didn't do anything, Daniel. I allowed systems to function. He went silent. That silence wasn't anger. It was realization. He was beginning to understand something terrifying. The structure he thought he was manipulating was structured long before he touched it. But here's the emotional twist. I didn't want him destroyed. I wanted him awake. Daniel, I said, softer now, tell the truth. To them. To me. Another long pause. Then the confession that cracked everything open. It wasn't supposed to just be temporary movement. My heart thudded once. What do you mean? Helena had promised fast-track residency through investment capital. But that required proof of substantial personal asset relocation. In simple terms? They needed visible money. Mine was clean. Established. Stable. Perfect. Daniel exhaled shakily. Mom. I think we were part of something bigger. And in that moment, I understood the full horror. This wasn't a son stealing from his mother. This was a family stepping into a financial mechanism already under scrutiny. And now international authorities were pulling at threads. Daniel, I said carefully, I can help you. Hope rushed into his voice. Really? Yes. But first, you tell them everything. Because what he didn't know yet was that my primary estate had never been accessible. What he moved wasn't my foundation. It was bait. And if I played this correctly, the person who orchestrated this would finally face questions she'd avoided for years. The $142,000 wasn't the real danger. The signature was. When Daniel said he had signed something, I felt a colder kind of fear settle in. Money can be reversed. Signatures are harder. What did you sign? I asked. There was background noise again. A door closing. Voices fading. He must have been alone for a moment. A declaration of capital intent. That sounded polished. Legal. Official. What does that mean in plain English, Daniel? It means I confirmed that the funds transferred were personally controlled assets intended for foreign investment residency qualification. In other words, he told authorities the money was his. Not borrowed. Not temporarily moved. His. And if investigators proved otherwise? That's when words like misrepresentation, fraud, and conspiracy start appearing in documents. Let me ask you something. How far can one bad decision travel before it stops being a mistake and starts being a crime? Daniel hadn't just moved my money. He had claimed ownership of it under penalty of international law. Who told you to sign that? I asked quietly. Helena said it was standard. Of course she did. Helena Strauss, 68 years old, former consultant, recently dissolved company under audit review. A woman who spoke in polished half-truths and wrapped risk in elegance. Daniel wasn't the architect. He was the latter. Now here's the part that shifted everything. I called Detective Rowan Pierce before calling Daniel back. Hypothetically, I asked, if an elderly parent had granted limited authorization to a child, but the child misrepresented ownership of those funds internationally, what happens? Pierce didn't hesitate. If the parent confirms the funds were not gifted or permanently transferred, liability shifts significantly. Shifts. Not disappears. But shifts. If the parent confirms coercive influence or misrepresentation, he added, primary investigative focus may move toward the advising party. Advising party. Helena. Suddenly the pieces aligned. This wasn't a spontaneous theft. This was staged liquidity. Helena needed demonstrable capital movement to satisfy scrutiny on her dissolved company. Daniel and Claire needed residency leverage. My surgery provided timing. But here's what none of them considered. I never collapsed financially. Because years ago, after my husband passed, I made one decision that saved me now. I placed my primary estate into an irrevocable trust managed by an independent fiduciary. My home. My retirement funds. My long-term investments. Untouchable. Daniel never knew the full structure. He assumed liquidity equaled wealth. He mistook surface funds for foundation. That assumption saved me. But it didn't save him. When I called Daniel back, his voice was steadier. They're asking if you consented. I consented to limited authorization, I said. Not ownership declaration. He swallowed audibly. So what happens now? Here was the crossroads. I could file formal elder exploitation charges. At 78, I would have legal standing. That would almost guarantee felony exposure. Or I could clarify boundaries without escalation. Let me ask you honestly. If it were your child, misguided, manipulated, but not malicious at heart, what would you choose? I chose precision, not revenge. I provided a formal statement confirming Daniel had limited transactional access. Funds were not gifted. I was under anesthesia during transfer. No ownership transfer had been authorized. But I did not allege coercion. I did not accuse him of intentional theft. That nuance matters. Because it narrows the lens. Within 48 hours, investigative focus intensified around Helena Strauss. Her dissolved consulting firm had outstanding documentation inconsistencies. The residency pathway she promised? Not illegal. But accelerated through aggressive capital display. Capital she didn't have. So she borrowed credibility. Through me. Claire began unraveling under pressure. She called me once. You set him up, she accused. No, I replied calmly. I set boundaries. Boundaries feel like traps when you're used to stepping over lines. Daniel called again 2 days later. They're releasing me, he said, exhausted. But they're retaining Helena's passport. There it was. Consequences, but not catastrophe. Claire? I asked. She's furious. She thinks we should have just waited. Waited. As if this was about timing, not integrity. And then Daniel asked the question I knew was coming. Mom, are we ruined? Ruined. Such a dramatic word for a temporary freeze and bruised pride. No, I said. You're confronted. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. I thought I was being proactive, he admitted. You were being impatient, I corrected gently. We ended the call without resolution. No dramatic apology. No cinematic reconciliation. Just distance. Weeks later, I was discharged from the hospital and returned home. My liquid funds were restored after review confirmed misrepresentation of ownership declaration. Helena's situation? Ongoing investigation. Claire and Daniel returned to the States separately. And here's the emotional twist no one anticipates in stories like this. The money coming back didn't fix the fracture. Because betrayal isn't about dollars. It's about assumption. Daniel assumed access equaled permission. Helena assumed age equaled vulnerability. Claire assumed urgency equaled justification. All three were wrong. A week after Daniel returned, he came to my house alone. No Claire. No Helena. He stood in my doorway looking 10 years older. Mom, he said quietly, will you ever trust me again? Trust. Such a fragile currency. More valuable than $142,000. I didn't answer immediately. Because trust doesn't return on command. It rebuilds slowly. Deliberately. And sometimes, never fully. But what I told him next would define the rest of our relationship, and force him to confront a truth far more uncomfortable than legal scrutiny ever could. What would you do if your child erased your life savings? That's the question I asked at the beginning of this story. Now let me ask a harder one. What would you do if the money came back, but the trust didn't? A week after Daniel returned to the United States, he showed up at my house alone. No Claire. No Helena. No polished explanations. Just my 45-year-old son standing on the same porch where he used to wait for the school bus, hands shoved into his coat pockets like a teenager caught breaking curfew. He looked tired. Not jet-lag tired. Consequences tired. Mom, he said quietly, can I come in? I let him. Not because everything was forgiven. But because avoidance solves nothing. We sat at the kitchen table. The same oak table where 6 months earlier the word streamline first entered the conversation. Sunlight came through the window exactly the way it always had. Ordinary setting. Extraordinary fracture. I messed up, he said. That was new. Not we. Not they. I thought I was being proactive, he continued. I thought I was securing something bigger for us. Us? I leaned back in my chair. Daniel, securing something bigger doesn't start with emptying someone else's foundation. He nodded slowly. Here's the part people don't expect in stories like this. I wasn't financially ruined. My primary estate had always been protected inside an irrevocable trust. My home, retirement accounts, long-term investments, untouched. The $142,000 was liquid capital. Significant, yes. But not my life's totality. I structured it that way years ago after your father passed. Why? Because grief teaches you something powerful. Love can disappear overnight. Security shouldn't. Daniel didn't know that. He assumed visibility equaled vulnerability. He saw accessible funds and thought that was the whole picture. That assumption nearly destroyed him. Let's talk about Helena. Her passport remained temporarily retained while financial irregularities tied to her dissolved consulting company were reviewed. No dramatic arrests. No cinematic courtroom scene. Just paperwork. Audits. Investigations that move quietly but carry weight. Claire? She stopped calling me. Which told me everything I needed to know. When pressure exposed cracks, she chose distance over accountability. Daniel, however, kept showing up. Not with flowers. Not with promises. With questions. How do I rebuild from this? That's the moment I realized something critical. Punishment teaches fear. Accountability teaches growth. So I gave him something harder than anger. Structure. I walked him through my financial planning system. The trust documents. The independent fiduciary oversight. The layered authorization design. I explained why I separated emotional trust from financial access. Because love doesn't eliminate risk, I told him. It increases it. He listened. Really listened. For the first time, he wasn't trying to accelerate anything. He wasn't trying to optimize. He was trying to understand. And here's the irony. The same discipline he once admired in me as a child, balancing budgets at the dining table, labeling envelopes, tracking every expense, was the discipline that prevented his mistake from becoming my destruction. The funds were restored after review confirmed misrepresentation of ownership declaration. My statement clarified boundaries without escalating into felony elder exploitation charges. That nuance saved him. But it didn't absolve him. Trust doesn't reset like a password. It rebuilds slowly. Through consistent behavior. Through transparency. Through humility. One evening, a month later, Daniel said something that stayed with me. When I moved the money, I convinced myself you wouldn't need it immediately. That's how I justified it. There it was. Justification. Most betrayal isn't fueled by cruelty. It's fueled by rationalization. He didn't wake up thinking, I will steal from my mother. He woke up thinking, this makes sense. And that's far more dangerous. Because it means anyone can slide there if they're not careful. Now let's circle back. When I woke up from surgery and saw $0 on my screen, I had a choice. React emotionally. Or respond strategically. I chose strategy. I let the systems work. I documented. I stayed calm. And that calm exposed the truth faster than rage ever could. If you're watching this, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Have you confused access with entitlement? Have you ever justified crossing a boundary because it felt temporary, necessary, logical? And if someone trusted you tomorrow with their financial keys, would you treat that as privilege or opportunity? Daniel and I are not back to normal. We are rebuilding. Slowly. Deliberately. Claire's influence has faded. Helena's legal situation remains under quiet review. The European residency dream? Postponed indefinitely. But something more important happened. Daniel learned that shortcuts disguised as strategy eventually collapse. And I learned that age does not equal weakness. It equals experience. If this story made you rethink trust, money, or the quiet ways families pressure one another, subscribe. Because the most dangerous betrayals rarely begin with strangers. They begin at dinner tables. And they unfold in moments when we assume love is protection enough. It isn't. Structure is. And sometimes, the strongest response isn't revenge. It's restraint.